Jesus, you brought heaven down. My sin was great, your love was greater. What could separate us now? What a wonderful name it is. What a wonderful name.
A picture to show the lesson that I want to teach you about what went on in the city of Jerusalem. I've traveled there, I can't even tell you how many times, over 50 into the city and seen those places. And I'm just going to pull them up with digital images, and I'm going to talk to you about the story of those last few days of Jesus' life. All of them occurred in the city of Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, in this set that you will see me show you today, we're going to see a stone pavement. It's about 20 feet under the ground. It's called the Lithostratos. It was part of the Tower of Antonia, which was the Roman fortress right on the corner of the temple complex in Jerusalem. But we're going to go below ground. We're going to find a courtyard that was out in the open in the middle of that fortress. That's where Pontius Pilate would have lived, and the Roman soldiers there with him guarding him. That pavement is actually referred to in one of the Gospels. As the story is told, we are told that when Jesus stood in front of Pilate, when he was beaten by the Roman soldiers, that they were actually at a place called the pavement, capital P. That means that it was a well-known spot. So that's one of the things that I will show you this morning, but I'll also show you many different places and try to explain that story of what happened those last days of Jesus' life and exactly where we believe that they did happen. Jesus changed the world in the springtime of the year. As God looked down at the world he had created, all of the beauty that still exists in flowers and natures and animals and yes, even human beings, God saw the problem that mankind had created to distort what God had originally made. So somewhere back in the eons of time, God looked down on this earth and God said, I need to step down and I need to save these people. The earth on which he had placed us to live from the very beginning was distorted, in some ways beautiful from a long distance off, but once you get your feet on the ground and see what mankind had become, God said, I have to do something to help them. So God, who is called the Father in heaven, reached down like a grandfather and took us by the hand and began to lead us to the places that we needed to go. That journey that God started began in the city of Jerusalem, actually a little ways south in Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. But so much of his life and so many of his teachings and miracles were done in the environs of this ancient city of Jerusalem. You can still see the walls going around the city. Actually, this section of this very large modern city is called the Old City of Jerusalem. The last week of Jesus' life, most of what happened in that time period occurred within the area of this city of Jerusalem. Matter of fact, across the valley in the upper right of the picture, you can see some of the buildings on the Mount of Olives. I know exactly where on that spot the Garden of Gethsemane is located, where he spent that last night of his life. And yet, we're going to walk there, and we're going to see exactly what we can tell about those times that are talked about in the New Testament. In Jesus' day, there wasn't a gold dome sitting on the Temple Mount. There was the massive temple that Solomon had built and had committed to God, and then rebuilt by Herod the Great. In that last few days of Jesus' life, he's on the Mount of Olives, he's with his disciples, and he instructs them to go into Jerusalem and find a man with a donkey and to tell him, our master needs the donkey. And so they brought that donkey back over probably about the top of the Mount of Olives, and Jesus got on that donkey and began to march into the city of Jerusalem, not as a conquering hero, not like a king, not like a general in the Roman army. He rode in as a servant on a donkey. And in that riding in, there were, on what we call Palm Sunday, People that had palms, they were waving them in the air. They were laying their cloaks and robes on the ground underneath the donkey's feet as he made his way into that ancient city of Jerusalem. He would have crossed the Hinnom Valley. He would have crossed this valley, which we now know as the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley was a place that Jesus crossed, going back and forth from Jerusalem over to the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane, even across it up and over the Mount of Olives, where he would visit the home in this little village of Bethany, where Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus lived. It was the miracle of him raising Lazarus from the dead that presaged his own rising from the dead. The walls of the city are actually built on the foundations of what the walls were primarily in that Roman period. We can even trace some of the stones that were built in that construction, stones like these that have a central piece sticking out and then a finer border all the way around four sides of it. It's called a boss, B-O-S-S, and it was one of the classic ways that buildings were built in the days when Herod the Great was the king of Israel. Because you see this wall that you're looking at here, that's the Temple Mount. That wall was built by the architects and engineers and the labor of people under Herod the Great. Same king that had all of those little boys killed in Bethlehem, trying to keep out the new king that he had heard about. He built massive buildings, and many of them still, there's evidence of them standing today. In that time, the temple actually had a colonnaded porch around it. You can see here what is a sample or a model of the old temple. You can also see on the upper right corner of that temple complex 4 columns. That building that you see there on the upper right corner is actually a Roman construction. It's called the Tower of Antonia. It was the headquarters for the Romans, for Pontius Pilate and others when they came to the city of Jerusalem. And we're going to find where that building was located that last few days of Jesus' life. It was here that he was drugged in front of the Roman leader, Pontius Pilate. It was here that he was buffeted and beaten by the Roman soldiers. And we will visit that as part of this journey. If I took you to Israel today, I could show you along the bottom of the wall here in the center an actual road that was a part of the Roman town. If you walk down the sidewalk on the right-hand side lower, go up to the intersection and take a left between those 2 walls, you'll actually be walking on a street that Jesus walked on, and his disciples no doubt walked on. Part of that street went right along this wall. This is actually the western wall of the Temple Mount that was built by Herod the Great. I'll tell you, if you walk right up to the edge and bottom of those different rows of stones, you'll see Herodian stones, exactly like the one, smaller one, that I showed you previously. We know that these are courses of the wall that Herod the Great had built as an embankment to hold up the Temple Mount. People today walk up to that wall, and you can see them as they stand at least 4 or 5 courses of that stone. And you can see the little margin going around the edges of it, where we tell that it was actually built by Herod the Great's builders. Those stones are very outstanding. I mean, they're unmissable if you ever see the design of them. That particular street I pointed out to you actually ran under a bridge that was a ramp to go up to the Temple Mount. This is one of them. There were about 4 or 5 entrances to the temple. I like to think Jesus probably coming out of the streets and houses of the city, that this would have been the ramp that he would have walked up, literally a bridge that led all the way up outside the picture to those outer porches of the temple. Okay, now you see the arch in the upper right, directly below it. The street has been excavated. Matter of fact, not only has it been excavated, we can see where, when the Romans destroyed the temple in AD 73, we can see where they hurled the upper stones from the temple wall. They came crashing down, and this big pile you see setting in the middle of the street, you can see the stones of the street, the pavement still in place, cracked and kind of pushed down, but that's the surface Jesus would have walked on. To the right is a curb, because on both sides of that, there would have been shops where he and his disciples maybe got lunch, bought fruit, just all kinds of things that they could have done in that city. So this whole complex you're looking at is 2,000 years old. We'll go to an entrance of a tunnel, and we will walk down now below ground about 52 feet total. If you look at the upper stones, those are actually the bottom course of stones on that temple that I showed you, the Wailing Wall. This is the bottom course of it, but we're 52 feet below ground. You can see the bedrock, the solid stones that go up about halfway up the picture, and then everything else on it are smaller stones until it gets leveled at a certain point, and then the massive stones began to be laid. When we go under that part of the old city of Jerusalem, walking those streets that Jesus would have walked, now that far below all the destruction and different time periods and cultural periods, you can actually see the bottom of an arch. So we're actually standing underneath an arch that in Jesus' day would have had a street on top of it, perhaps steps on top of it going to the temple. When we get to the bottom row of all of those stones that held up that temple wall, these are the stones. Look how clearly you can see on that bottom course the boss that is going around it, just the little bit of margin edge that was characteristic of Herod the Great's builders. As we walk along that Roman street that far underneath the ground, we see columns. This used to be a section, hard to imagine this far below the rubble and destruction, but this is actually a section of the street on which Jesus and his disciples would have walked, the early believers. These are Roman columns. In Jesus' day, these would have been outdoors, and they would have been right along the sides of those streets. We have to find them through the work of archaeologists way down below the ground. They will take you to a building here that they say was where the Last Supper took place. You remember that Jesus sent his disciples to get a man to set up a room, and when they did, it was on an upper floor. So we go into this building and we go to an upper floor, but it's not original. It's not actually where Jesus was. It's just a place that they like to show tourists. If we want to go exactly where Jesus was that last night of his life, and that next day when he was crucified, we would walk along the course of this valley here. It is the Kidron Valley, Kidron, crossed by Jesus and his disciples many times. As they walked down through that valley late that day, they would have seen the walls going around the city. They would have seen, like today, homes built at angles on those steep slopes, but they made their way toward the Garden of Gethsemane. They would have seen a lot of evidence of death. Archaeologists working in this area have found tombs that were actually burial spots when Jesus was here. You can see places with a door on the front, like we're going to see when we get to the tomb that I think Jesus was buried in. We would also see, and Jesus would have also seen along the way, these Roman coffins. They're called sarcophagi. You can see the elaborate carvings in the side of various, Roman gods, wreaths of palm and pomegranates. But this is where a very wealthy person would have been buried. This would have been their coffin, probably located outdoor. Simpler people with not as much income might be buried in an ossuary like these that have been found all over the country. These are carved out of limestone. They have engraving on the side that indicate that they're primarily Jewish. Inside, they would have not found a body, because the way they buried people in that day, they would actually let the body decay until all you had left was a dried up skeleton. And they would put the skeleton in this, they'd put the lid on it. Sometimes more elaborate burials, when you're going down the Kidron Valley toward the Garden of Gethsemane to the upper left, you would have passed this tomb, built for some noted dignitary. It has the name Absalom's Pillar, like it was where David's son Absalom was buried. There's no evidence of that. Matter of fact, you can see a hole in the side where somebody broke in to see if they could find riches on the inside of it, but it's still there, and it's still called Absalom's Pillar, and it would have been there when Jesus walked down the Kidron Valley. Where Jesus was headed for was actually a spot that today has become famous, I guess, for its burial. We're standing on the western side of the Mount of Olives. We're looking across at the Temple Mount, where it would have stood in Jesus' day. You can see the wall going around it. But today, Jewish people who want to be buried very close to where they believe the Messiah will come, this is where they want to be buried, close to where they think the action will take place. You can see on tops of their tomb stones. They don't bring flowers and place them at a grave. They bring stones. They pick one up, they lay it on the top to indicate that they have been there. But right down the hill from where you saw those tombs is this building. It's a church. It's one of the oldest churches in Christianity. It's called the Church of All Nations. On the ground below it, on the lower level, you see the olive groves. There's olives planted all over the country of Israel, just like there is in all of the Mediterranean countries. But centuries ago, the earliest Christians in some of the earliest period of time believed that they found the olive grove, the place that would be Gethsemane, where Jesus went with his disciples to pray a lot of times, and where he went that last night of his life. This is called the Church of All Nations. There is a stone under its there is a stone under its dome, very large, that they say was where Jesus knelt when he prayed. There's no evidence of that, but you can see to the left of the building, you can see bougainvillea growing on the wall. Behind that is this set of olive trees. Those are what we call Gethsemane, and I'll show them to you closer and tell you how old some of them are. The mosaics on the church are absolutely beautiful. On the front, little tiny mosaics paint a picture of Jesus kneeling. On either side of him are his disciples that went with him, but that went off to the side, and you remember fell asleep. If you go inside the building, we'll see the stone. They have circling it some iron that looks like a crown of thorns or maybe a thorny bush to kind of indicate what Jesus was going to go through on that night. But it's outside of there that we really see what I think is one of the most meaningful spots that I visit in all the times I've been in Israel. In the upper right above it is a Russian Orthodox church. The Russians have a different spot that they call the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a beautiful spot. A beautiful church. Gold domes, onion-shaped on the top, like many buildings you would see if you went to Russia. Very shiny, very beautiful in the sunlight. But it's really the other spot I want you to see. Gethsemane. Gethsemane is actually a word that means the grinding press, where they would harvested olives and they would have mashed them to make wine, where they harvested olives, like you'll see the trees in this garden, and they would have mashed them down to get the olive oil. And so that old wall overlooking this spot is filled with olive trees. The gate that is closest to it is called the Beautiful Gate. It has been closed for centuries, and there is an old tradition that it will stay shut closed until Jesus comes back. And when he comes back, he'll sit down on the Mount of Olives, and he will enter into what then will be the holy city. If you go in the Garden of Gethsemane, the beauty of the flowers in this area is just magnificent. This is bougainvillea that grows now all over the country. But inside that garden, you'll see flowers, you'll see paths to walk, and you're going to see inside that garden, if it was where Jesus was that last night, you're going to see olive trees. And these olive trees, some of them have been carbon dated, and they are at least 2,000 years old. If that is true, they may have been a young tree planted during the days of Jesus. There would have been some older ones like this, but it could be that trees that were just beginning when he was here are now still living and, by the way, still bearing olives. Their trunks are gnarled. They are misshapen because of how old they are. But I will tell you that I've stood in this place so many times, and I've prayed to our Lord, and I've actually felt like I was where he prayed one of the last prayers of his life. a prayer of surrender to the Father, a prayer where he was honest about what was getting ready to happen, a prayer where he said to the Father more than once, "If it's possible, then let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." You have to realize Jesus prayed that prayer, I think, from his human side. He was both fully human and fully God. And I think from his human side, he knew what was coming. He knew what he was going to suffer. He was simply talking to the Father about it. While he was praying in that garden, up came the soldiers, Roman soldiers, other Jewish leaders, to take him, to bind him, to tie him up. I have a feeling the look on Jesus' face probably knocked him back, as the scripture describes, because I think his look was so absolutely massive in its power. But they took him. It is here that Judas Iscariot kissed him, fingered out and put who he was, and then they took him. I think they took him back over this area here. They took him across the Kidron Valley, up the Hinnom Valley, to the south of the temple that you see in the upper left, the Temple Mount. And I think it was somewhere in the, and all of this trial, false trial, would have taken in this lower element that you see on the lower city. But there is a church built there over what could be the spot of the house of Caiaphas. It is the church you see in the center of the photo. It is called the Church of the Rooster Crowing, okay? St. Peter in Gallicantu, which means the rooster crowing. We believe, some scholars believe, it was in this area that they took Jesus to stand in front of the high priest, Caiaphas. They did find a Roman road. It leads up out of the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valley and from the Temple Mount right up to where this house and structure was located. But it is a Roman road. Outside the structure, we're going to walk in for a few minutes. They found evidence of a house. These are storage rooms. They are wine presses. They show that somebody important lived in the vicinity of this house. And all of that evidence seems to point to the fact that this was a significant house. Somebody important lived here. It certainly would have been convenient for Caiaphas as the high priest to walk down that Roman road, go over to the temple, which he probably would have done daily as he deals with all of that. But there is perhaps evidence this is where all of this action took place. There's a rooster on top, out of gold, and when you walk up and see it, you begin to have these feelings of the evil of the Jewish leaders of that day. I don't mean that this man is evil. I simply toss this in with a couple of others to show you how those leaders would have dressed. They would have been in the finest of fabrics. They would have been the leaders of the religion. If you go to Jerusalem today, they would be epitomized by, those who are Orthodox Jews. They have a particular way of dressing. They only wear these kind of clothes every day. They come to the Wailing Wall every day to pray in what they think is the closest proximity to the site of the ancient temple. There's all kinds of things that they do. But when I see them, and I've talked to some of them, they remind me of those religious leaders in Jesus' day who say they were so exactly right in everything that they were doing, but they were so exactly wrong in what they believed. Underneath that church of Gallicantu, there was a prison cell. It was carved out in the basement of the church. It actually had steps leading down into it, you see in the center, or leading up out of it. But when the prisoner was lowered from the bottom step down to the floor, it was way too deep for that prisoner to jump out and escape as if they thought there was any way they could. And if they took Jesus and held him until the Jewish leaders could get there, this would have been where he would have been. Now, look at the top of that underground cell. You can see a circular opening. Many believe that's where they lowered food and water, perhaps, to those that were prisoners here. They may have even lowered a prisoner by ropes versus bringing them down those steps. But if you look at the wall of that round hole entrance at the top, I want to show you something that was carved into that wall that gives significance to this location. I'm standing now on the steps that led down into the prison cell. You can see some of my people standing at the bottom. That's how deep it was. I'm just looking from the vantage point of where they would have brought Jesus in. That round hole in the top of it, in the side of that hole, was this cross. Now, why is this significant? It is significant because this is the oldest cross in Christianity. I mean, the kind of cross that we have today with the upper beam pointed way up and the cross beam about 2/3 of the way up on it is not the way the cross would epitomized by those earliest of Christians. This is called the Jerusalem cross. If you'll look at it, it actually is 5 crosses. Okay, so you've got the central cross in the center. At the end of each of those pieces going out in 4 directions, you have another slot carved at the end of it. You can see it clearly in the one above and the one below. That for them was another cross. So that in essence, this Jerusalem cross is 5 crosses together. Why? Because they wanted to have a cross that pointed out the 5 wounds in the body of Jesus. The Jerusalem cross, that is 5 crosses, stand for the imprints of the cross and the nails in both of his hands, the nails in both of his feet, and then the spear thrust by the Roman soldier into his side. So they wanted to show those 5 wounds in the body of their Lord. Finally, early the next morning, they marched him down the streets, the narrow streets of that city. They were going to take him out, to that 4-tower fortress that I told you about. If you see in this drawing the temple to the right of the old city, you see at the upper left of that temple, the Antonia fortress. That's where they took him to stand in front of Pontius Pilate. Here to the left, on the corner of the temple, you can see the Tower of Antonia. You can see here a closer photo, very massive with all of the towers. And the reason they built it at the corner of the temple is because when Jews would riot and revolt, it usually started with somebody in the temple area. The Romans wanted to look over, so if anything happened, they could shut it down as quick as they could. In this vicinity, though, they would have had an open courtyard in the middle of that fortress, open to the sky. So when archaeologists started excavating right there in that spot, they wanted to see, can we find any evidence of the Tower of Antonia? So they dug down about 20 feet. And what you would see and walk on, if you could go to those remains today, would be this massive stone pavement. We can tell that in Jesus' day, it was a nice pavement in the center of the Tower of Antonia. Very smooth from wear and tear. You could see gutters to drain off rainwater because it was in the open. You can see one in the lower portion of the photo where water would have gathered and it would have been run into a cistern. Not only would this have been outdoors where it would have been raining and they would have gathered water, but I'll show you where this water actually ran into. The cistern that was below this, we've actually found preserved. So we're going to step down into that cistern. Here is another kind of little groove where the rainwater would have gone off of it. It would have gone into holes like you see here between 2 stones, and it would have drained straight down, into the large cistern below. If you went with me to Israel, we would take some steps even farther down than that stone pavement. Matter of fact, where we're standing right now, the stone pavement is overhead. This is the water cistern built by the Romans underneath that stone pavement. So all the water they collected during the rainy season for watering plants, drinking water, all the need of water in that area, there are actually 3 of these cisterns. This is only one. And if I could walk you over to the end of this little platform, you could look over to the right and ahead of you, and you could see this thing still has water in it. There's actually still rainwater from above that when it rains finds its way into this cistern. Back up on the pavement, we can see where they took some of the stones and they did striations, kind of a grooves in them, which indicated that When it was outside, the Roman soldiers walking, leather sandals. If it was wet, it'd be very slippery on this limestone. If they brought a horse in, which we think they did, then the horses needed a stone texture they'd be able to walk on. So it's very rough in places, but one of the most illuminating stones is this one. That night that they put Jesus through the trial, the Roman trial, you remember that the Roman soldiers took all of his clothing, and they wanted to gamble for his clothes. And so the Bible says that in whatever game they were playing, that they cast lots, okay? Well, now lots are simply a way of saying dice. They took dice, and we found dice, by the way, in some of our ancient excavations that were used in games in some of the ancient tales that I've excavated. They'd take those dice, they'd roll them on the stone, kind of like playing maybe Monopoly or Parcheesi or something of that nature, because all the design you see here is a well-known Roman game. And we believe that when those Roman soldiers gambled for his robe and his clothes, this is the game they played. It was right out where they would be holding him, right out in an easy access place. Let's just go ahead and throw the dice and see who gets it. I believe so strongly when I go to this place called the Lithostratos, the stone pavement, that it was here that those Roman soldiers gambled and moved their pieces, however they did it, to see who would be the winner and see who would get what few clothes of Jesus there was. They didn't put his clothes back on him. Matter of fact, there's great, agreement. They stripped him like a criminal down to nothing. They beat him with whips. They beat him mercilessly until his back would be like hamburger meat, nearly as bad as it was. And remember this, guys, he had gone to the Garden of Gethsemane late that day before. So he hadn't slept that night. He hadn't had any food to eat during all of this, all the way up to his crucifixion. And when the Roman soldiers took him, it says, they put a Roman robe on him, and they made fun of him. They put a crown on his head made out of thorns, and they mocked him by saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him with their whips, and they hit him with their sticks. It is a wonder that Jesus could even walk all the way out to Calvary, where they finally crucified him. The thorns would have caused him immense pain, along with all the other things that happened, and they would have drawn blood, which would have drained the energy from him. When they left that place, they just walked out through the city. Matter of fact, if I took you right now to the Via Dolorosa, what is called the Way of Sorrows, where different things happened in that last walking trip of Jesus from the Tower of Antonia all the way over to the gate on the north side of the old city called the Damascus Gate. When you went out the Damascus Gate, you were on the road that went to Damascus. Same highway, by the way, the Apostle Paul would have taken when he went from Israel to Damascus to take Christians captive and drag them back to Jerusalem. It was there on that road that this Jesus, who performed and did his death in this locality, appeared alive and made himself known to Paul and completely changed his life and changed the course of history. But before that encounter, Jesus was dragged down these streets. I believe there would have been people on those streets, maybe even the children of those Jewish leaders that were Orthodox, like these young men here. Certainly women that were out shopping, places that would have been known by him because he had gone through there so many times. This map that you see is reproduced several places in Jerusalem and in Israel. The letters you see above, it's actually in Greek, okay? And the word says Hagia Polis, okay? Hagia is holy, Polis is city, and then the last letters would have been Jerusalem. So it's a mosaic of the holy city of Jerusalem. If you look to the to the left, there's a big gate indicated on this flat map, and you will see that when you walk in, you go down the main street of that town, from the left all the way down to the right. Then it breaks up into other streets, but notice on both sides of that thoroughfare, see the columns They're black in this photo, like they're laying on their side. But there's a row of columns on the left and a row of columns on the right as you walk down here. You see the red that is above the columns on both sides, upper and lower? That's the red tiles. That's the roofs that would have been over the shops and the various businesses that lined this main street through Jerusalem, called Cardo Maximus, okay? The main street. Now, I love the fact that that street has been found. When archaeologists excavated this ancient city of Jerusalem, you can see to the upper right the modern level, okay? Those are modern streets in the ancient city. But when archaeologists went down about 15 to 20 feet, they encountered this massive Roman street. Matter of fact, not just the street, they found the stones, they found the columns that would have lined that street. Every one of them has a capital on the top of it, which is called a Corinthian capital, well-known design all the way through the Roman world. So on both sides, you would have had columns, you would have had shops, you would have stepped up off the street onto the sidewalk, and then you would have bought whatever you were there to buy. But this is an actual street that was here when Jesus was here. And I'm firmly convinced that it was an actual street that Jesus walked during his life when he would be in Jerusalem. We're going to on that street, the Via Dolorosa, that last picture you saw, that was the way Jesus walked as they marched him out to Calvary to nail him to a cross. When I'm in Israel, crosses are prominent in that country. I usually have all kinds of them. I give to friends. These particular ones are made out of olive wood, and they remind us of the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane. On Easter Sunday, we will begin at the Via Dolorosa. We'll walk the way that Jesus walked, as far as we can trace it, out the Damascus Gate, over to a hill that looks like a skull, which is what was described, when he was crucified. And we will talk about those end events leading to his death, then to his burial, then to his resurrection. I hope that you'll join me next Sunday.
Where are you now when darkness seems to win? Where are you now when the world is crumbling? Oh, I hear you say, look up, child.